Robert Durst, the potential heir to multimillionaire Seymour Durst, was on track to inherit a vast empire. However, numerous accusations of deceit, murder, and erratic behavior led to his estrangement from his family and the legacy company that might have been his. Those closest to him often faced violent, premature, and unresolved fates until recently. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, to Seymour Durst and Bernice Herstein. He grew up in Scarsdale, New York, with his three younger siblings, Douglas, Thomas, and Wendy, just north of the city where the family amassed their wealth. While Durst later became infamous in his own rights, he was born into a family whose name carried a lot of weight and wealth in New York City. Joseph Durst, Robert's grandfather, had built a $1 billion real estate empire with the Durst Organization, starting with his first building purchase in 1912. Today, the company is one of the city's largest family-run real estate organizations, with his brother Douglas at the helm. Durst's younger years were fraught with trauma. When Durst was 7 years old, his mother fell off the roof of their home and died. Durst claimed that his father had brought him to the window and witnessed her death, though his brother Douglas disputes that claim. At the time, the newspapers had said Bernice had fallen off the roof after overdosing on asthma medication, but some family members, including Robert, claimed it was suicide. Durst struggled with his mental health after his mother's death. When he was 10 years old, he was assessed by a psychiatrist who claimed Durst couldn't be treated because he had personality decomposition and possibly even schizophrenia. Durst attended Scarsdale High School, where classmates described him as a loner. He then attended Pennsylvania's Lehigh University, where he graduated in 1965 with a bachelor's degree in economics. He then enrolled in a doctoral program at the University of California in Los Angeles, where he met Susan Berman, an aspiring writer who quickly became his close friend. Durst withdrew from the UCLA program and moved back to New York in 1969. In the fall of 1971, he met Kathleen "Kathy" McCormick, an 18-year-old dental hygienist who lived in one of the buildings owned by the Durst Organization. They had met when Durst went to pick up the rent. Kathy had just moved to New York City from Long Island. She was a bright, charming young woman who was incredibly warm and like Abel the moment she walked into a room. The two instantly hit it off. Kathy didn't mind his cool affection and described him as sweet and sensitive. In the early 1970s, Durst opened a health food store in Vermont called All Good Things. After just 2 dates together, Durst asked Kathleen to move into his home near the store, and in January of 1972, she took him up on the offer. The couple were smitten, though there were many times when the couple's 10-year age gap caused issues. The two also came from two totally different worlds. Durst from wealth and power, Kathy came from a modest Irish Catholic household. She had very much been swept up in the lifestyle that came along with being a Durst. A year later, after pressure from his father to move back to New York City and work for the Durst Organization, Robert closed his health food store and moved back to the city with Kathleen. On Durst's 30th birthday, April 12, 1973, the two were married. Their marriage had started off a loving one, but when they moved from Vermont back to New York, there had been remarkable change. Kathy said that Seymour Durst brought out the worst in Bobby, and he had turned into a completely different person from the man she fell in love with in Vermont. At first, Bobby loved showing Kathy off, taking her to the best and biggest events in New York, and showing her his world. It was a world where Kathy shined brightly, and even Seymour approved of his new daughter-in-law. But as time went on, Robert's affections turned even colder, and for a long while, Kathy kept just how miserable she was to herself. Occasionally, she would drop hints that Robert had an anger problem. At first, it was just yelling, then turned to pretending to hit her, but each year the hints would get worse and worse until eventually they were no longer hints. Kathleen's brother, Jim McCormick, said he first witnessed Durst abusing Kathleen at a family Christmas party when he grabbed her by the hair. Kathleen had kept numerous diaries filled with details about how Kathleen had been suffering in the marriage. Robert was cheap, and despite having a vast bank account, watched over every penny that Kathleen Lean spent. People never understood why the budding socialite, married to a millionaire, was working so hard in medical school to become a doctor. She would laugh and tell people it was her calling and that she wanted to have a career on her own, but becoming a doctor also would give her some freedoms. Money that she earned herself and could be spent or saved as she needed. A few years into their marriage, Durst had dropped a bombshell. He didn't want children, which devastated Kathy. She poured her disappointment into school, but it caused a fracture in their relationship that never quite repaired. Durst said that he might consider adopting, which had given Kathy a little hope, but every time she set up an appointment with an agency, Durst refused to go. In 1976, Kathy got pregnant. Durst was enraged and accused her of getting pregnant on purpose. He forced her to get an abortion, threatening divorce if she didn't. She went through with the procedure, but fell into a downward spiral of grief and depression. It was also around this time when she learned for the first time that Durst was having an affair. She had learned of the affair when she discovered Polaroid pictures of their medicine cabinet and closets. When she asked what the photos were, Durst revealed he'd had a woman in their home, and he'd moved things around to make the apartment appear to be only occupied by him. He had used the photos to put everything back where it belonged before Kathy returned. This had caused an unrepairable rift between the couple. After this, no love remained in their relationship, and Kathy seemed to be the only one suffering. In early 1982, 29-year-old Kathleen was in her final year of school at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, studying to become a pediatrician. That same year, she was treated for facial bruises at the Bronx Hospital. She had confided to a friend that Durst had beaten her when she confronted him about another affair. She knew he'd taken up with a woman named Prudence Farrow, the same Prudence that the Beatles sang about in Dear Prudence. The stresses of medical school alone were crippling enough, but the near daily physical and emotional abuse was breaking Kathy. She began to drink excessively and use drugs to cope with the abuse. She barely slept or ate, and friends noticed their once bubbly bright friend was a shell of her former self, detached and constantly frayed and nervous. Kathleen wanted a divorce and began telling friends that she was going to leave Durst once she finally finished medical school. Durst caught wind of that, and in response, he canceled her credit cards, removed her from their joint bank account, and refused to pay for her next semester's college tuition. She then demanded a divorce and $250,000 settlement. She had told friends she was threatening Durst. She claimed to have proof that Durst had been embezzling money from his father and had made fraudulent claims on his tax returns as well as her own. Soon before Kathleen disappeared, she was at her New York City apartment with two friends, Bill Stevenson and George Kearns. According to Bill, he had gone to the city multiple times to help Kathleen plan an escape from her violent marriage. One morning, Bill said Durst showed up at the door, threw a wad of cash at Kathleen's face, and said, "This isn't happening." Referring to the divorce, Kathleen told Robert she was done and moving to Delaware. George, who also witnessed the incident, said that there was a lot of yelling and screaming. He said, whatever happened could have happened that morning if we hadn't been there. I mean, he had just no control over himself, just kind of out of his mind, angry. 10 days later, Kathleen was gone. Kathleen was last seen alive on January 31st, 1982. She had attended a dinner party without Robert at her friend Gilberto Najami's home in Connecticut. She had shown up unexpectedly, and according to Gilberto, wasn't acting like herself. While Kathleen typically wore high-quality clothes, she showed up in red sweatpants. She was also visibly upset when she arrived at Gilbert's. Durst called her multiple times during her visit, screaming through the phone for her to come home. Though she didn't want to, she eventually left the party to return to their house in the South Salem hamlet of Westchester County, New York. Gilberto said in an interview, "The last conversation that I had with Kathy was a very powerful conversation. As she was leaving my house, she turned to me and said, 'Gilberta, promise me if something happens to me, you'll check it out. I'm afraid of what Bobby might do.'" It was the last time anyone besides Robert sees Kathleen. According to him, he and Kathleen argued that night. Kathleen wanted to go to their apartment in the city instead of staying at the house, so he dropped her off at the Katnoa train station to get the 9:15 p.m. train to Manhattan. Afterwards, as he told the New York City Police Department, he went for a walk, had a drink at his neighbor's house, spoke with Kathleen on a payphone, and then went to bed. The neighbors he allegedly had seen, Bill and Ruth Mayer, later testified that Durst lied to the police and that he never visited them on the night of Kathleen's disappearance. Ruth also testified that Kathleen had told her in private that Durst was abusing her. Though Ruth encouraged her to report it, Kathleen was afraid to. Before her disappearance, Kathleen had made plans to meet Gilberto at a pub in Manhattan, but Kathleen never showed. Gilberto was worried and called the police several times over the next few days after not seeing or hearing from Kathleen. On February 4th, Kathleen's college called Durst and said she called in sick on February 1st and had missed a full week of classes. And so on February 5th, Durst reported his wife missing. Detectives wondered why Durst had waited so long to report his wife missing. He very calmly explained that he and Kathy often spent days apart when she was working and studying so much at the hospital. He was described as completely calm and unmoved. He seemed completely unfazed that his wife had been missing for several days. What had made things even more peculiar, he took to the press soon after, offering a $101,000 reward for information leading to her safe return, though he later reduced it, saying the original article had made a mistake. Kathleen's family found out in the newspapers, having no idea that Kathleen had gone missing. Due to his high-profile status, the disappearance, and Durst himself gained a lot of media attention. So his longtime friend, Susan Berman, stepped in as his unofficial spokeswoman, making statements and answering questions on his behalf. During the initial police investigation, the doorman at Kathleen and Durst Manhattan apartment building claimed to have seen Kathleen at the building on February 1st, but he only saw her from behind and far away, so he wasn't certain if it was her. He later told the investigator that he hadn't seen her at all, and that he actually might not have even been working during that time. 3 weeks after Durst reported Kathleen missing, the building's superintendent found her belongings in the building's trash compactor. Kathleen's friends took her disappearance into their own hands and broke into Kathleen and Durst's South Salem home in hopes that they'd either find her or find clues to her whereabouts. When they arrived, the house had been turned upside down. Kathleen's mail had been ripped open, and her belongings were stuffed into the garbage. In their Manhattan apartment, Durst had thrown so many belongings into the garbage chute that led to the building's incinerator that the building manager asked him to stop because he was clogging up the chute. He threw out her clothes, medical school books, jewelry, everything that belonged to Kathy. When Kathy's friends had been searching the South Salem home, they also found an itinerary that they thought had been written by Durst. It outlined every single thing he did that night that Kathleen went missing, as well as the days following. They passed it on to the lead detective working the case, who agreed it was an odd thing to do. Innocent people don't need to write down an exact minute-by-minute recounting of their day, though someone who needed to keep their lives straight might. While New York City police explored leads and questioned Durst, it didn't go unnoticed that higher-ups were not pushing them to solve the case. The investigation had only been a few weeks in when it was already beginning to wind down. Normally, high-profile cases like this would bring in all sorts of people to breathe down the necks of detectives. Not this case. It seemed that the Durst family didn't care about New York's finest working the case at all. They certainly weren't cooperating with law enforcement. Durst refused interviews, polygraph tests, and even answering the most basic questions, though he did take several interviews with reporters. At first, playing the role of concerned and sympathetic husband, though his tone quickly turned to annoyed and began to slander Kathleen. He told the press that he believed Kathleen had left him and would run off with another man. There was so little evidence in Kathleen's disappearance. Law enforcement had even worked with several psychics to try and develop new leads. Though they had suspicions, Durst was involved. He had lawyered up with one of the best criminal attorneys in New York. And without evidence, the case went cold, and slowly, Robert Durst's missing first wife was reduced to a file in a cold case locker. After Kathy's disappearance, Robert Durst takes a big step back from the New York City social scene he once dominated. He only kept a close circle of friends, primarily just consisting of Susan Berwin and a select few others. Between 1992-000, Durst attempted to reinvent himself starting with his marriage. In 1990, he sold the South Salem home that he and Kathleen shared, and unbeknownst to Kathleen's family, filed for divorce from his still missing wife claiming spousal abandonment. Durst allegedly started behaving oddly at work, which included urinating in trash cans. While he was next in line to take over his family's company, his father Seymour appointed his younger brother Douglas to the position in 1994 instead. Durst accused his brother of stealing the company from him, causing a rift between Robert and the rest of the family. In 1999, the New York City police reopened Kathleen's missing person case. They searched Durst's former South Salem home for the time, as well as the nearby Truesdale Lake. Then in 2000, the investigation into Kathleen's disappearance became public. In November of 2000, Durst left New York after his sister, Wendy, told him that police were reopening Kathleen's case. He escaped the city to avoid police inquiries and started renting a $300 a month apartment in Galveston, Texas, where no one knew who he was. While living in Galveston, he pretended to be a mute woman named Dorothy Steiner, a name he took from a high school friend. While in Galveston, he was spotted wearing women's wigs around town and visiting the library to look up articles about himself. Durst later said he posed as a mute woman because of his distinctive voice. He believed anyone would have been able to identify him if he spoke. The next month, Durst married Deborah Sheraton, a Manhattan real estate broker he had been dating off and on for the past decade. It was a hasty ceremony officiated by a single rabbi picked out of the phone book. They are still married to this day, though they have reportedly never lived together over the course of their marriage and have gone years without speaking. Little is known about his time in Texas. Little is known about why he married Deborah so hastily. Though in New York, spouses are legally exempt from testifying about their spouse and are also exempt from disclosing confidential communication. Then, according to Durst, Susan Berman called him in December of 2000. The police wanted to interview her about Kathleen's disappearance. In December of 2000, Susan Berman was living alone at her home in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, where she was working as a journalist and author. A so-called mafia princess, Susan wrote about her family ties to reported gangsters, more specifically her father, David "Davy" Berman, a Las Vegas mob boss. Susan and Durst became fast friends after meeting as students at UCLA. When she was 12, her father had died on the operating table, and her mother had died of a drug overdose a year later. These traumas bonded Susan to Durst as he and was very protective of him. When Susan got married in 1984, it was Durst who walked her down the aisle. The two had been nearly inseparable for decades. When Kathleen had disappeared, Susan had been Durst's unofficial spokesperson. He would give her statements through Susan, and she had also been his alibi for the night Kathleen had gone missing. However, she and Durst drifted apart when he disappeared out of the blue for years. She eventually left New York, settling in California instead, where she wrote 2 books about her life as a mob boss's daughter. Though her life was actually quite sad, she spun it to sound like an incredibly glamorous life growing up as mob royalty. Susan was also an incredibly paranoid person. She always thought people were after her because of her work. Though many of the people she wrote about were long gone and a lot of the old mafia days she had experienced as a child were long gone by the 2000. No one else really gave credit to her paranoia. They always described her as being incredibly hyperbolic, dramatic, and over the top. Leading up to her death, Susan was short on money. She was facing eviction from her home and was absolutely flat broke. And in desperation, she reached out to Durst. Though she wasn't able to get a hold of him conventionally, she instead left a voicemail message on a phone number he maintained in New York. Without a word, he gifted her $50,000 that she used to pay her debts and get herself back on track. She had recently been hired to work on a couple new big projects. Things were starting to look up for Susan. She had been grateful to have the little brother she never had back in her life. However, she was contacted by the Westchester District Attorney, Janine Pirro, who informed Susan she was reopening the Kathy Durst case 18 years later and wanted to interview her. Susan had never been interviewed in the initial investigation. The interview had been arranged to take place sometime early in the new year, and somehow the fact that the new DA wanted to interview Susan Berman had made front-page news in New York. On December 19th, Susan spoke with her friend, actress Kim Langford, telling her that she had the story of a lifetime and had information that was going to blow the top off things. Kim assumed the information was related to a project she was working on about her life growing up around the mob in Vegas. She also told Kim she had recently spoken to a psychic who had told her she'd die a violent death that involved a gun. On Christmas Eve in 2000, police were called to Susan's home after neighbors reported that her dogs were running loose on the street and barking wildly. Police arrived at Susan's home and found the back door ajar. In the doorway of one of the bedrooms, they found Susan Berman, 55 years old. She had been shot execution style with one bullet to the back of the head. There were no signs of forced entry and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Police determined she'd been murdered a day or two before the discovery of the body. Some speculated that it was a mob hit made in retaliation for the information she was about to reveal in this upcoming project. Others suspected her manager, Neil Brenner, who she reportedly had a very turbulent relationship. Friends said that because of Susan's career, she was extremely paranoid. They said she always had her home locked up tight, and never opened the door to strangers. So they felt it was unlikely that she had been murdered by someone she didn't know. That left only a handful of people who Susan trusted implicitly. But when Westchester County District Attorney, Janine Pirro, revealed that Susan had been on the short list of witnesses she wanted to speak to about Kathleen's disappearance, many of Kathleen's friends speculated Durst had killed Susan to keep her quiet, though those from Susan's social circle said she wouldn't have testified against him due to her mob-like loyalty. Soon after Susan's body was discovered, Los Angeles police received an anonymous letter postmarked for December 23rd. The letter was addressed to the Beverly Hills Police with Beverly misspelled. Inside the note had Susan's address with one word: cadaver. As it turns out, Susan did have key information to share. According to her friend, Linda Obst, Susan told her that she was the one that called the New York Albert Einstein College of Medicine on February 1st when she had allegedly called in sick. According to the prosecuting attorney, Durst asked Susan to cover for him when Kathleen had first disappeared by posing as Kathleen and calling in sick to school so people would believe she'd made it to Manhattan. They theorized that Durst had killed Susan after her scheduled interview with the police, fearing she'd turn him in. Miriam Barnes, Susan's close friend, testified that Susan called her and told her that she'd done a favor for Durst, but was nervous telling her about it. She told Miriam, "If anything happens to me, Bobby did it." A closer look into Durst's activity revealed he'd been in California in late December and had left on a late-night flight from San Francisco to New York on the day she was murdered. At the time of the investigation, Durst was questioned about murder, but never charged. Robert Durst did not attend the funeral of his oldest and dearest friend, Susan Berman. On September 30th, 2001, a man fishing with his son in Galveston Bay discovered a human torso floating in the water. They called the police and searched the area and found several garbage bags, each bag containing dismembered body parts. A total of 12 bags were found. In the bags, I also found an outer packaging for a bow saw, a receipt for garbage bags and drop cloths, and a newspaper that contained a handwritten note and address 2213 Avenue K. At the address, searched the garbage cans nearby where they found more black garbage bags similar to the ones they had already recovered. Inside the dumpsters, they found an empty trash bag box, packaging for a drop cloth, packaging for a 4-inch paring knife, a .22 caliber shell casing, and an eviction notice addressed to Morris Black. Morris Black was one of the tenants in the shared home on Avenue K. He had been a veteran with a murky past. He was estranged from his family and his ex-wife. He lived a nomadic life, and if he occasionally reached out to someone, he never disclosed where he was. He had landed in Texas sometime in the mid-90s, and he'd been arrested in '98 for threatening to blow up a utility company over an issue with his bill. His lifestyle made it hard for a timeline of his life to be tracked down. There were decades of time without any documentation tying him to any particular place. Those in Galveston who had met Morris described him as a grumpy old man who was suspicious of everyone and prone to screaming outbursts. He used to live in New York, but seemed to have gone off the grid in 1982. It was also discovered that Black had a $130,000 in an out-of-state bank account. Despite not having worked for decades, he had been living off of the money for many years. Friends and family of Black had no idea he had that kind of money, and he was now missing. they were able to execute a search warrant for Morris' home. Once inside, they discovered blood evidence everywhere. In the bathroom sink, the kitchen, in all of the drains. They sprayed luminol throughout the apartment, and it lit up like Christmas. Walls, floors, and drag marks that led from Morris's apartment to the apartment across the hall. The apartment across the hall belonged to Dorothy Steiner, a mute old woman whose neighbors had little to offer about who this woman was. She was rarely seen, had been known to travel frequently, kept her shades drawn, and kept to herself. Investigators got a court order to enter, and again, found blood everywhere. In Dorothy's kitchen, there had been several cuts in the linoleum, and when officers pulled it back, they had discovered pools of dried blood underneath. Unlike in Morris's apartment, this apartment hadn't been cleaned thoroughly. There was dry blood splatter all over the place, along with a paring knife, a cleaver, a hand saw, and a pistol, which was suspected to be the murder weapon. One of the bags recovered from the bay was empty. It had a large rip in it, and officers concluded that it was the one that contained Morris's head, which was the only body part not recovered. It also likely contained key evidence that would answer the question that still remained cause of death. They had been able to compare fingerprints from Morris's time in the military to those on the body to identify him. A medical examiner determined that body parts recovered from the bay were that of 71-year-old Morris Black. Dorothy Steiner was also missing, and police turned their attention to finding her. They had been able to determine that Morris had likely been murdered in his apartment, but had been dismembered in her apartment. Why had a man been dismembered in an old mute lady's apartment? It didn't make sense. They were able to unravel Dorothy's true identity when they found a receipt in the building's trash. It was from a local optometrist, and it had Durst's name on it. With that information, they concluded that perhaps there wasn't a Ms. Steiner. Perhaps Robert Durst had been masquerading as an old mute woman. Neighbors couldn't recall seeing Dorothy around the time that Morris disappeared, though they did recall seeing a man loading garbage bags into a Honda CR-V. They hadn't recognized him, but noted he made several trips in and out of Dorothy's apartment. Police took down a description of the vehicle and put out a bolo. They also looked in the national databases to try and get any information they could about Miss Steiner. They found her, and she was alive, but claimed to not reside in Galveston, Texas, and she certainly wasn't mute. When asked if she knew Robert Durst, she replied that she did. They had attended high school together back in the 50s. She was baffled. She hadn't spoken to Durst in decades and had no idea why there was an apartment rented using her name and social security number. 7 days later, a vehicle matching the description is found, and they pull over the driver and search the car. Inside, they saw a bow saw and visible blood in the trunk of the vehicle. They arrested the 58-year-old driver on October 9, 2001, a man named Robert Durst, and charged him with the murder of Morris Black. After paying a $300,000 bail, Durst left Texas and went on the run. After failing to appear at his court date, he was declared a fugitive. While on the run, Durst had the nerve to rent a car in Mobile, Alabama under the name Morris Black. And then, in another strange twist, he was found and arrested at a Wegmans grocery store in Bath, Pennsylvania. He was accused of shoplifting a $6 chicken sandwich, bandages, and a newspaper. And even though he had $38,000 in cash with him at the time, along with 2 loaded handguns. Also in his car was a Medicaid card and a driver's license belonging to Morris Black. Durst had also shaved all of his hair as well as his eyebrows, and at first, he hadn't been recognized as the millionaire fugitive. It was only when the arresting officer ran his social security number that he discovered the warrant for his arrest. In January of 2002, he returned to Texas to stand trial for the murder of Morris Black. According to Durst's testimony, he came home on September 28, 2001 to find Morris in his apartment angry. While Morris had a key to the apartment, Durst hadn't been expecting him. Durst said that he immediately suspected Morris of taking the gun that he'd stored in the oven. When Durst asked him where it was, Morris reportedly stood and pointed it at Durst. Durst claimed that he grabbed the gun and the 2 men fell to the ground. That's when the gun went off, though he says he never touched the trigger and killed Morris with a gunshot to the head. Durst claims he tried to get the help of a neighbor, but no one answered. so he went back to his apartment and started cleaning up the blood himself. He said he then drank a bottle of Jack Daniels and dismembered Morris' body before dumping it in the Galveston Bay. Durst said he didn't go to the police because he didn't think they'd believe him, given his past, reputation, and suspicious situation. Though according to a private investigator, Bobby Baca, she had been able to piece a connection going way back of Durst and Morris Black. Morris had a brother, Harry Black, and the two of them owned a construction business in New York back in the 80s. According to family members, it had been funded by the Durst organization, specifically Robert Durst. Harry had passed in 2003, but his wife had said that when he learned that Morris had been murdered, he was concerned that he would be next. When asked why, he said that he knew dark secrets. Black's wife told Baca that she believed that the brothers knew something about Kathleen Durst's disappearance. Prosecutors believe that Durst murdered Morris when he found out his true identity, and he killed him out of fear that he'd been found and charged with Kathleen's murder. Robert had specifically chosen Galveston, and he arrived concealing his identity as an old woman, only to show up at a low-income housing building next door to a man that he used to fund to do work for him. And if we believe Durst murdered Susan to tie up a loose end regarding Kathleen's disappearance, perhaps Black had also been connected in some way. In his trial, Durst had hired the best criminal defense attorneys that money could buy. The trial lasted over 2 months, and despite a mountain of evidence, on November 11, 2003, Durst was found not guilty of Morris's death and was acquitted. It was a shocking end to a brutal trial. He was initially put on a $3 billion bail due to his previous bail jumping and tampering with evidence, but the amount was eventually lowered to $450,000 after a court found the amount unconstitutional. In October of 2004, just as he was about to be paroled, Pennsylvania authorities charged Durst with weapon possession stemming from his time on the lam. In July of 2005, he was released from federal prison and sent to Texas to serve parole. But Durst couldn't seem to stay in one place. In December of 2005, he was arrested for a parole violation for making unauthorized trips to Galveston. He got caught after visiting a Texas mall, where he happened to run into the judge who was presiding over his murder trial. In February of 2006, Durst was released from prison, and his parole supervision ended 9 months later. Once again, he was a free man. 4 years later, Durst's infamous deeds were brought to the big screen for the first time. In December of 2010, All Good Things, a movie loosely based on Durst's life starring Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst debuted. The movie is about a man who kills his wife, best friend, neighbor, and dog. After its release, Durst contacted the director and praised the movie, but said that he didn't like that the dog was murdered. Him and the director Andrew Jarecki kept in contact over the years, and despite Durst's lawyer's advice against it, Durst eventually agreed to appear in an interview for the HBO documentary series Jarecki was making about Durst's life. It was called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. Jarecki first interviewed Durst in 2010, during which Durst denied any responsibility for Susan and Kathleen's deaths and disappearances with the help of Susan's stepson. It was a letter written by Durst, and it includes the same misspelling of Beverly. In his second interview with Durst, Jarecki brought out both letters and confronted Durst with the similarities. During a break, Durst goes to the bathroom and is recorded saying this. In the interview, Durst also admits to lying about what he told police about the night Kathleen went missing, that he told police he dropped her off at the train station and visit his neighbors because it was what they wanted to hear. In 2013, the director began sharing his footage and discoveries with the police. In 2014, the filmmakers discovered the recording of Durst seemingly admitting to the murders, and the LAPD concluded that Durst authored the cadaver letter sent to the police, arming them with the evidence needed to arrest Durst. The day before the final documentary episode aired, March 14, 2015, Durst was arrested on a warrant charging him with the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. Police found him at the JW Marriott Hotel in New Orleans along with the .38 caliber revolver, marijuana, $40,000 in cash, a map of Cuba, a shoulder-to-head latex mask, fake IDs, and his legitimate passport. Police suspected he was preparing to flee the country to Cuba. Durst was arraigned the next morning and held on bail pending an extradition hearing. The next day, he waived extradition so he could face the murder charge in LA, but it was delayed after Louisiana State, police charged him with felony weapon possession. The New Orleans judge denied Durst bail on the charges and determined Durst to be a flight risk. In February 2016, he accepted the plea deal on the charges and was sentenced to just over 7 years in prison. In November of 2016, Durst was transferred to Los Angeles County Jail to await trial for the murder of Susan Berman. During questioning, he tells a prosecutor that he was high on meth when asked why he would agree to be Jinx. The next year, Kathleen McCormick Durst was declared legally dead at the request of her family. Her family alleged from the beginning that Durst was involved with her disappearance and murder. The trial for Susan Berman's murder began on March 4, 2020, but it was halted for 14 months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In May of 2021, the case was resumed. During Susan Berman's trial, it was announced that Kathleen's case had been reclassified as murder and would be reinvestigated as a homicide case. On September 17th, after 3 days of jury deliberation, Robert Durst was found guilty of first-degree murder of Susan Berman, as well as lying in wait and killing a witness. Less than a month later, Los Angeles County Judge Mark Windham sentenced Durst to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That same month, the Westchester County, New York District Attorney's Office announced the Westchester County Grand Jury would be impaneled to hear witness testimonies and evidence in Kathleen's disappearance. In late October, Durst tested positive for COVID-19 and was hospitalized. The state investigator, believing Durst may not live long enough to be indicted, filed a criminal complaint charging him and Kathleen's death. On November 1, 2021, Durst was indicted by the Westchester County Grand Jury on second-degree murder charges of Kathleen McCormick Durst and is currently awaiting trial. Time will McCormick Durst and is currently awaiting trial. Time will tell if he lives long enough to face it. Though the decades-long horror show put on by Durst may soon come to an end, it's not soon enough for Kathleen's family. In a statement, they questioned why it took over 40 years to get an indictment accusing prosecutors of protecting the Durst family and the NYPD of failing to conduct competent and a thorough investigation into Kathleen's disappearance. They said in a statement, "We want both closure and justice for Kathy and our family who has suffered from her disappearance, murder, and concealment of her remains. There may also be other potential victims that could be connected to Durst, and we're going to discuss those now." On December 10, 1971, in Middlebury, Vermont, Lynn Schultz went into a health food store called All Good Things. There, she purchased some dried prunes. She'd been seen eating them while standing at a bus stop in Court Street around 12:30 p.m. She was 18 years old and had been a student at the Middlebury College. She returned to campus and was seen at her dorm. She left around 1 p.m. to attend the final exam, but never showed up. She had last been seen at 2:15 p.m. at the same bus stop she had been at earlier, near All Good Things, and from there, she vanished. Campus security did not initiate a search until 2 days after her disappearance, and the college didn't alert her parents for a week. Friends and family had noted she was homesick, but also knew she had studied relentlessly for this exam that she never got to take. And no one was able to explain why she'd never shown up, and instead had last been seen near a health food store. Her disappearance remains a cold case and is marked as a possible foul play. In 2015, authorities announced that they would be looking at Robert Durst as a possible suspect. Another young woman went missing, this time in 1997. Karen Mitchell was 16 and living in Eureka, California. Karen had visited her aunt's store on November 25, 1997, and she was headed to her part-time job at the Coastal Family Development Center. She was last seen walking down the road, and some witnesses claim they saw her get into a vehicle with an older man driving. The car was described as a blue Ford Granada or a Mercury Monarch or a Nissan. The driver was described as a Caucasian male, approximately 50 to 70 years old, with a balding, light gray, or sandy blonde hair. The unidentified man had green or gray eyes and a large-sized nose that appeared to have been previously broken. He had a small build and wore eyeglasses. The driver was wearing a long-sleeve button-down light blue shirt. A missing person report was filed later that day by her aunt, who would learn she'd never made it to work when she went to pick up Karen. Extensive searches were undertaken, which had even included sniffer dogs. It was as if she had dropped off the face of the planet. The driver was never located for questioning. Durst's connection was credit card charges, putting him in the area of her disappearance. He also owned a home only 25 minutes from Eureka in Trinidad, California. He sold the home in 2000 after the murder of Susan Berman. It wasn't until the body of Morris Black washed up that Durst was finally brought to justice, though had his body not been found so quickly, it likely would have been lost forever, taking with it all the evidence that had connected Durst to the murder. The medical examiner that had done the autopsy for Morris Black had noticed that the cuts had been precise and practiced. Based on how Black's body had been dismembered, the medical examiner had thought the person responsible had either medical training or had been a hunter. Durst was neither, and it called into question how he got so skilled at disposing of murder victims. Durst had also used several aliases while he traveled. He also used several different social security numbers to rent cars, hotel rooms, credit cards, and rent apartments. Many of these aliases were people he knew from school, real people that had very faint connections to Durst. His aliases included Robert Allen Durst, a man of no relation but an exact same name, Robert Dean Jasowski, an old schoolmate, Ralph Durst, Everett Ward, James Cortez, Jim Terse, James S. Fleischman, Johnny Smith, Emilio Vignoli, Dorothy Steiner, Diane Wynn, James Closty, and Morris Black, and those are only the ones that we can connect to Robert Durst. While he was traveling across the country, he often rented older cars, never anything flashy. He would dress down in inexpensive clothing, sometimes in full drag, and would often try to be as nondescript as possible. He would rent dirt-cheap apartments across the country paying in cash a trace, only to open a credit card or rent a car years later. We may never have all the answers. Durst has faced several health issues in recent years. Though only 78, he appears to have aged dramatically, and he maintains his innocence despite exhaustive evidence against him. And to this day, it is unclear why he'd been so willing to murder Susan and Morris Black to cover up what he had done to Kathleen. Why had he been so willing to commit multiple other murders to cover up Kathleen's disappearance? There is always hope that one day he may decide to open up about what had actually happened to the people closest to him that had met untimely demises. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. On the quiet evening of October 19, 2004, a 28-year-old mother named Keisha Brown was found lifeless in her home in Las Vegas, her body battered and violated. The police were left with a thin trail of evidence and no suspects in sight. The case eventually went cold, but the detectives never forgot Keisha. Several years later, the hunt for her killer reignited, and DNA technology helped shed new light on the investigation. So who was this ruthless murderer? And what was their motive behind this killing? Las Vegas is a city that never sleeps. It is the most populous city in the state of Nevada with its iconic casinos, world-class entertainment, and endless nightlife. It's no wonder that this desert oasis has become a playground for adults seeking thrills and excitement. But beyond the glitz and glamour lies a fascinating history. From the early days of mobsters and showgirls to the modern-day transformation into a global entertainment capital, it is within this fascinating city that a brutal murder case unfolds. Keisha was born in the mid-1970s, but much of her life is shrouded in mystery. There is not much known about her early years as there is scarce information about her parents' names, the school she attended, or whether she had any siblings. But what is certain is that she was a young mother living in a modest apartment on the bustling East Flamingo Road in the year 2004. Her daughter Kalia was her pride and joy, and she would do anything to ensure her little girl had a better life. What exactly Keisha did to make ends meet is also unknown, but what is evident is that she was a survivor, a woman who refused to let life beat her down. At the time, Keisha was also in a relationship with a man who was only identified as her boyfriend and whose connection to Kalia remains unknown. The events of October 19, 2004, which was a Tuesday, would forever be etched in the memories of those who knew Keisha. That day, witnesses saw a stranger arrive in a red sedan and park outside her apartment. No one knew who he was or what his intentions were, but he wasted no time in entering Keisha's apartment. It is not clear where Kesha's daughter was at the time, but she was not around and was safely away from the apartment. For several minutes, the man was inside, and then he finally emerged with a duffel bag in his hand. He darted back to his car, started the engine, and sped away into the night, leaving a trail of speculation in his wake. Those who saw him would later describe him as a black male with a stocky build. Some 7 minutes before 7 p.m., Keisha's boyfriend made his way to her apartment eager to see his beloved. But when he knocked on the door, there was no response. Frowning, he tried the doorknob, and to his surprise, it turned easily in his hand. With a sense of foreboding, he pushed open the door and entered the apartment. Silence greeted him, and his voice echoed through the empty apartment as he called out for Keisha. But there was no response, and this was when his anxiety began to mount. With each passing moment, he searched the apartment, moving from room to room. It was in the bathroom that he found her lying motionless in the bathtub concealed beneath a pile of clothes. With a jolt of shock, he realized that something was very wrong. She wasn't moving, and as he leaned in closer, he could see that she wasn't breathing. He could also see blood and realized that she had been stabbed. He checked for a pulse, but there was none to be found. Keisha's boyfriend's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. He knew he had to act fast if there was any hope of saving her, and so he raised an alarm. Within moments, concerned neighbors started streaming into the apartment, alerted by the commotion. The minutes that followed were a blur of chaos and confusion as multiple people frantically called the emergency line to report what had happened. Time seemed to stand still as they waited for help to arrive. At 7:13 p.m., the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department was informed of the incident and rushed to the apartment. They were joined by paramedics who arrived at the scene, but it was too late. Keisha was beyond saving. Her body was carefully removed from the apartment and taken for an autopsy. The moment detectives arrived at the crime scene, they knew they had their work cut out for them. They meticulously collected DNA evidence from the scene, which they stored away knowing it could be the key to unlocking the mystery. They also began questioning anyone who might have seen or heard something, including Keisha's boyfriend. It was during one of these interrogations that they heard about the strange man in the red sedan who had been seen visiting Keisha's apartment from eyewitnesses who had seen him. The detectives couldn't shake the feeling that this man was involved in Keisha's death, but all they had was a vague description of the man's appearance. No one had been able to get a good look at him, and there was no surveillance footage in the area to help them identify him. But the detectives refused to give up. They combed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, and talked to anyone who might have information. They knew that every lead, no matter how small, could be the key to solving the case. The results of Keisha's autopsy were soon revealed, and the findings were nothing short of disturbing. The Clark County Coroner's Office, which conducted the autopsy, concluded that she was strangled to death in a brutal homicide. But that wasn't all. The autopsy also showed that Keisha had been assaulted, stabbed, and beaten. The news sent shock waves through the community as people tried to come to terms with the brutality of the crime. The hunt for the perpetrator continued, with law enforcement leaving no stone unturned in their pursuit of justice for Keisha as they worked tirelessly day and night to solve the case. The detectives couldn't help but wonder who the mysterious man was and what he knew about Keisha's untimely demise. Despite their relentless efforts, the case remained unsolved, leaving Keisha's family to mourn their loss and grapple with the question of who had taken her life so viciously. As time went on, the case went cold. After years of gathering dust, Keisha's unsolved case finally got a second chance when it was assigned to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Homicide Cold Case Unit. In August of 2022, the department decided to do a review of the case, bringing together some of the most experienced detectives to work on it. As the team began to sift through the details of the case, Detective Dan Long discovered a new lead that had previously been overlooked. He recognized a pattern that he had come across in some cases he had investigated back in 2005. Detective Dan had previously worked on a case that involved the murder of 3 unrelated young women on different occasions. The 3 women were murdered in a similar manner and their bodies had been left in the same way. A man by the name of Norman Flowers had been the culprit in all 3 cases, and he was currently serving 3 life sentences in prison. Norman's criminal history was a chilling and gruesome tale of terror. During the first few months of 2005, he embarked on a spree of burglaries that turned into violent attacks. His first known victim was 18-year-old Sheila Quarles, the daughter of his ex-girlfriend Deborah Quarles. Norman had spent a total of 10 years in prison and had been paroled twice. It only took him about 20 days after his last release to murder Sheila. On March 24, 2005, he barged into Sheila's apartment and viciously assaulted her in the bathroom. He brutally beat and then strangled her to death. To add insult to injury, he left her body face up in the tub, which was filled with scorching hot water. Before fleeing the scene, he took her cell phone, bank card, and jewelry. In the weeks that followed, Norman played the role of the supportive ex-boyfriend, even going so far as to recommend counseling to the bereaved Deborah. Little did she know, the monster responsible for her daughter's murder was right under her nose. On May 4, 2005, more than a month after the incident, Norman struck again. This time around, he targeted not one but two women in the space of just 8 hours. First, he broke into the apartment of Marilee Coote, a 45-year-old woman who had the misfortune of crossing paths with a depraved criminal. Norman bludgeoned, assaulted, and ultimately strangled her to death, but he was not done yet. As the night wore on, he descended on another apartment belonging to the 25-year-old Rena Gonzalez. Like Marilee before her, Rena was no match for the viciousness of Norman's attack. She was assaulted and strangled with a telephone cord. Norman was interviewed by the police a few days later, but he denied any involvement in the gruesome murders. His lies, however, were no match for the power of forensic evidence. With the help of DNA that was found on Marilee's body, detectives were able to catch him. On June 6, 2005, his reign of terror came to an end and he was arrested and charged with the murder of Marilee. The evidence against Norman was overwhelming, and the authorities were also able to link him to the murders of Sheila and Rena. In 2008, Norman went to trial for the murder of Sheila. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty against him, but Norman's family members pleaded with the jurors to spare his life. They testified that Norman had suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child, which had left him traumatized and unstable. Despite his family's testimony, the jurors found Norman guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In August 2011, he received 2 more life sentences for the murders of Marilee and Rena. Detective Dan's heart raced as he pored over the details of Norman's grisly crimes. He felt deep down that Kisha's unsolved murder was somehow connected to this man. He knew that he needed concrete evidence to make an arrest, and DNA testing was the only way to confirm his suspicions. With a sense of urgency, Detective Dan quickly packaged up the evidence from Keisha's case and sent it off to the DNA lab. He couldn't wait to get the results back. The thought of finally bringing closure to Keisha's family after all these years drove him forward. It's not been disclosed which pieces of evidence were sent for testing. The days turned into weeks, and Detective Dan and the rest of his team grew increasingly restless. They knew finding Keisha's killer was crucial, not just for justice, but for their own peace of mind. Finally, on December 21, 2002, the call they had been waiting for came in. The results were in, and they were conclusive. The evidence from Keisha's case was a match for Norman's DNA. After years of searching, they had finally available evidence. It also became clear that Keisha had been Norman's first victim. After this, the detectives began to formulate a plan to bring Norman to justice for the murder. They didn't have to look for him since he was locked up at the High Desert State Prison in Nevada, where he was serving his 3 life sentences. On February 23, 2023, the detectives secured an arrest warrant for Norman. The charges were severe, and this included open murder with a deadly weapon, sexual assault with a deadly weapon, and burglary with a deadly weapon. The detectives were determined to make sure that Norman paid for his crimes against Keisha, no matter where he was. As the news of Norman's arrest spread, a police briefing was held on the same day. Keisha's family was invited to attend, and her daughter Kalia arrived with a heavy heart, visibly shaken and emotional. With tears streaming down her face, she expressed gratitude towards the police force for providing her with a sense of closure. Kesha's murder is a tragic reminder of the dangers that can lurk in our communities. Despite the devastating loss, Detective Dan and his team's unwavering also raises questions about the failings of our justice system and the need for better prevention and rehabilitation programs to prevent such tragedies from happening in the first place. So how do you think we create a safer society for all? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On a cold winter morning on January 2nd, 1983, 28-year-old Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, died in her home in the Durham neighborhood of Washington County in Oregon. No foul play was suspected, and it was believed she took her own life. The case went cold as it was believed to be a suicide, and the family tried making their peace with Nancy's death. After 40 years, new evidence came into light that changed the entire course of the case. The mystery of Nancy McEvers' case finally reached its conclusion in 2023. What had happened to Nancy that day? What new evidence led police to find the answers after 4 decades? Welcome back to Mysterious Hook, where we shed light on under-the-radar cases across the country. Today, we are looking at the 40-year-old cold case of Nancy McEvers that has finally received closure in 2023. Washington County makes up the Portland metropolitan area and is the second most populous county in Oregon, which has 36 total counties. Away from the bustling cities, the breathtaking scenery and the lush greenery that surrounds the area is one of the main reasons why people find comfort in the Washington County of Oregon and like to settle here. The hills and mountains that envelop the majestic landscape, friendly people, and the old-fashioned homes are the charm of this region. Home to about 600,000 people, it is the most populous Washington County in America, with a culturally vibrant community and a myriad of options for recreational activities, like hiking, nature walking, and fishing. It offers a haven for people seeking to get away from the rush of daily life. But sadly, it also holds dark secrets, and it is here that our case takes place today. Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, was born in Oregon in 1955. Nancy's mother, Lenore Pepper, now 97, was used to hearing the words sweet and beautiful when people spoke about her daughter. Everyone, whether they knew her for years or had just met her, referred to her as a friendly person. Nancy was close to both of her sisters. Being the middle child, she was loved by both her elder sister, Janet Agliaitis, and her younger sister, Diane Jarwilal. She often acted as a mediator between her mother and the sisters. Her loving and caring nature, coupled with her outgoing personality, was why people loved interacting and spending time with her. She had always been the caring one among her sisters, and her maternal instincts were really strong. So when she got married to Randy McEvers and had a son, she really enjoyed being a mom. It was one thing that everyone knew about her. She loved being a mom. Nancy's love towards her own child and for her sisters carried the sisters' childhood dreams forward. All the 3 sisters had planned on raising their kids together. Coincidentally, the 3 sisters had their first children within 18 months of each other. The plan of giving them a happy and close-knit upbringing was already in the works, but in a tragic twist, it was to be left incomplete in the end. January 2nd, 1983 was a cold winter's morning in beautiful Washington County in Oregon. Around 10:38 a.m., police received a call from Randall McEvers. Randall seemed to be distraught that his wife had taken her own life. Washington County Sheriff's Office deputies reached the 173100 block of Southwest Rivendell Drive located in the Durham neighborhood, which was not a part of Washington County then, but was incorporated into it after 1983. The police officers, assisted by the Oregon State Police Medical Examiner's Office, Oregon State Police Crime Lab, and Washington County Medical Examiner's Office, found the body of Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, with a gunshot wound to the head. Despite the nature of the wound and very low chances of Nancy making it out alive, paramedics rushed to get Nancy to a nearby hospital. She was almost immediately pronounced dead. On the surface, the death of Nancy McEvers checked out as a suicide case. Investigators found and seized a Smith & Wesson revolver from the crime scene. It was only when the police started interrogating people that inconsistencies started showing up. When the alleged suicide had happened, it was just Nancy who had been home with her 30-year-old husband and 1-year-old son. The crime scene made the detectives ask the question whether the suicide happened in a closed space or if Randall was a witness to it. The interrogation that followed raised the red alarms. The police had to wait for forensic reports to take the investigation forward. When they got the reports back, the case of Nancy McEvers, née Pepper, turned out to be a lot more complex than the police had anticipated. Following the autopsy report, forensic tests, and ballistic tests, it did not take long for investigators to understand that there was something else at play here. The medical reports by the Oregon State Police Crime Lab soon revealed that the case could not have been a suicide. There were way too many things that were off. A person who has recently fired a gun would have residue on their hands and clothes, which is tested by lifting samples and processing them to check for fused particles of lead, antimony, or barium. The first inconsistency was that Nancy had no gunshot residue on her hands, but it did not prove anything directly. This is because the residue can only be detected within 6 to 8 hours of the shot being fired, and it can easily be washed away from being in contact with other things. So while it was an important discovery, it was not enough. The second inconsistency arose when the medical examiners reported that Nancy's wound was too broad for it to be a suicide case. The wider the wound, the greater the distance of the gun's muzzle from the person. Further, it was also mentioned in the report that the charred particles on her clothes meant that Nancy was struggling or trying to defend herself. Nancy had been home alone with her husband Randall and her 1-year-old child. Randall had not mentioned the presence of any other person or instances of forced entry. So naturally, the police had found their prime suspect. Detectives initiated their interrogation with Randall. After giving them basic details, he went on to confess that Nancy and him were struggling over the gun. And during that chaos, he didn't remember who had pulled the trigger. When the police prodded more and asked the questions again, Randall retracted his statement, changed the story, and presented a new version to the officers. He told police that he had just entered the room when Nancy was pulling the trigger. There was no struggle possible, as she had already shot herself by the time Randall walked into the room and realized what was happening. Both these versions were exactly opposite to one another. It was important to find out what had really happened. So the detectives approached the people who were close to Nancy, including her relatives, friends, and co-workers. Every one of them suspected Randall to have some kind of involvement in her death. The police had just wanted a little more evidence to finally make a sense of the situation and build a strong case against Nancy's husband. So the police called in Randall for questioning again 2 days after the initial interrogation. They could not get a confession out of him. Randall's parents then showed up at the police station and assured them that their son was ready to go through a polygraph test to highlight his innocence. But Randall was a no-show for the scheduled test. By April, he had entirely stopped cooperating with the police. Without any other leads and new evidence, the police marked the case of Nancy McEvers' alleged suicide as cold. A week after Nancy's funeral, her family members were informed that no foul play suspicions had led anywhere, and there were no further leads in the case. So the family tried their best to put this dark chapter behind them. After her death in 1983, not only was her son deprived of all the love that Nancy had to give, but also her entire family changed forever. They were deeply affected by the news. Nancy was such a huge part of their lives that they were never the same after she was gone from their lives. When Nancy's family found out about her death, they could not believe it. She was a cheerful and easygoing person who loved every bit of raising her child. To think that Nancy shot herself dead with her son still in the house was unbelievable to her family. She would never have done anything like this, which would separate herself from her son in such a final manner. Lenore Pepper, Nancy's mother, had her doubts about Nancy's death. She suspected Randall but could not say anything about it. She had already lost her daughter, and after the police officially told them that there was no foul play suspected, Lenore Pepper let her suspicions die. With no charges against him, Randall was responsible for raising his 1-year-old son. Lenore did not want to stir up something she did not know how to handle. She had strong doubts about Randall, but stayed silent to protect her grandson just in case her confusions and questions turned out to be false. Not just Nancy's mother, but everyone who knew Nancy thought that it could not have been a suicide. But without any confirmation from the investigators, their doubts remained doubts. Nancy's sister believed that it was a terrible accident that was never meant to happen. She was just 28 when she died. Her dreams, her aspirations, and her entire life disappeared in a second. The case of Nancy McEvers had been closed for so long that no one expected it to be reopened by the detectives in August 2022. The officers assigned to the Violent Crimes Unit were in charge of the cold case investigations. When they went through the file of Nancy McEvers, they knew that justice had to be served. The world did not even know that Nancy hadn't committed suicide. She was murdered in cold blood. Before moving forward, the police went over the previously collected evidence. Detective Anel Sarek, part of the investigation team, called the case poorly investigated. The police work of the officers in the 80s was not thorough. And since the detective in charge from 1983 had already passed away, there was no way of knowing why the officers let this case go cold for so many years. The evidence taken in 1983 was retested by the Washington County Sheriff's Office Forensic Science Unit, and the forensic report came out to be exactly as similar to the previous one. The possibility of Nancy's death being a suicide was completely ruled out. The police now believed that this case had an angle of domestic violence that resulted in the death of Nancy McEvers. Investigators did not release a description in the media detailing which new leads were explored due to concern for the family's privacy. The police carried out interviews with around 20 people, some of whom were deputies, detectives, firefighters, and family members who were either present at the scene in 1983 or were closely involved in the case. Even after 40 years, Nancy's story was alive. It became evident as additional evidence came to light after all these years. Nancy's file mentioned that when the police were interviewing people who knew Nancy and Randall, they revealed that he had been planning to kill Nancy because she wanted to get a divorce and leave him. Anel Sarek, one of the investigators on the case, showed his confusion about no action being taken in the 80s despite direct evidence. He said, "Why they did the things they did, I can't tell you. But finally, everything was falling in place and Randall was slowly but surely turning out to be the prime suspect in the murder of Nancy McEvers." At this time, Randy was living in Tigard, a city in Oregon, 10 miles south of Portland. The police approached him at his house in January 2023 and questioned him about the incident. He told the detectives that he had gone through hypnotherapy to make him forget everything related to that day. The police by now had enough leads, and they wanted Nancy's family to receive real closure. So after their interview with Randall, they referred the case to the district attorney's office in Washington County for their review. The information that Nancy's family had been living with for 40 years turned out to be false. While there had been enough twists in the case of Nancy McEvers till this point, police were shocked to find out that Randall had taken his own life on February 8, 2023. He also wrote a note in which he denied any responsibility for Nancy's death. Although the DA's office could not review the case after Randall's death, the police believed that this was a closure in itself. After the death of their prime suspect, Nancy McEvers' case is now finally closed. It came as a shock when the police reached out to Leonore in August 2022. She could not believe that her suspicions about her daughter's death had been true all along. Nancy's mother, Leonore, showed her gratitude to the police officers for being able to see it through to the end. She wished Nancy's father had been alive to finally witness their daughter's story getting closure. Getting to know about Randall's suicide, Lenore Pepper said, "I feel like we got justice, but like I said, in a very strange way. But at my age, I don't know if I could have gone to a trial every day, so we have to accept that. That's all we can do." Nancy was loved by all, so the news of her vicious murder stirred multiple emotions. Her sisters stated that they felt every emotion all over again. But the entire family believed that Randall's suicide was as much evidence as his actual trial in court. He denied having any involvement in Nancy's death, but his own death turned out to be an acceptance that Nancy's family had been waiting for 4 decades. "We're exempt from going through a trial and being drugged," said Nancy's younger sister Diane Grill. "It was hard. It's been tough for 40 years. As my sister said, we've got the answers now because we need to finish it." Nancy's family is sharing the news with more of her loved ones, and they are planning to conduct a memorial service for her. After the shock of learning that their beloved Nancy had been murdered after 40 years, they have developed new grief and trauma. Nonetheless, The entire family was grateful to the investigation team who served justice to her. For 40 years, Nancy's family believed that she had ended her own life. Little did they know that their initial doubts about her death were all valid and led directly to the answer that Nancy's husband had killed her. Although the case has been closed now, Washington County Sheriff's Office deputies are still open for more information on Nancy McKeever's death. Do you believe that Randall killed his wife? Why didn't the detectives in the 80s make a solid case against Randall? Mojave County was the site of a murder mystery that continues to haunt the Sheriff's Department to this day. On January 23, 1971, a trio of hunters was searching for game in a remote desert area of Mojave County, Arizona, when they stumbled upon an abandoned camas sack. The sack was loosely tied with a white cotton rope and left alongside Hackberry Gravel Road in the secluded desert. It had the words "Deer Pack Ames Harris Navilco" printed in green on the side. Believing it to be an animal carcass discarded by other hunters, they decided to open the sack for a closer look. To their shock and horror, they found the contorted body of a woman. The police were called to the scene immediately, and they sealed off the area to begin their investigation. It was obvious to investigators that they were dealing with a homicide. Whoever wrapped the victim up in the sack was clearly trying to hide the body. It was also clear that the woman had been murdered elsewhere and her remains unceremoniously dumped in the desert, 2 miles from the US 93 highway near Kingman in Arizona. It was becoming apparent that the case was going to be an uphill challenge for investigators. And firstly, they needed to determine who the victim was, and secondly, where the actual crime took place. Having canvassed the immediate area for any clues or possible belongings of the victim, investigators came up empty-handed. No identification, no bag, and no purse were found anywhere near the crime scene. It seemed like whoever killed her had made sure not to leave any incriminating clues behind and made a clean getaway. Investigators sent her body away to the Mojave County Coroner's Office for a post-mortem, while they continued to question the hunters about any suspicious activity in the area. It was obvious from the beginning that the woman was a victim of homicide, as she had been stuffed into a canvas sack. Her cause of death, though, baffled investigators. Although her neck was broken, decomposition had already set in, making it difficult to determine if there were any ligature marks around her neck. It was initially listed as unknown, as she showed no signs of blunt force trauma or gunshot wounds. There were also no signs of a health-related death, such as a stroke or a heart attack, and her organs were listed as healthy. Toxicology reports also suggested no drugs or alcohol in her system that may have led to an accidental overdose. Much later in the investigation, the cause of death status was changed to strangulation based on the theory that she may have been murdered by someone she knew personally, perhaps a lover or spouse. It was also difficult to pinpoint the time of death, as her body had been partially frozen, but they estimate that she could have been killed any time between December 1st, 31st, 1970. Toward the end of bull hunting season, they began working on creating a workable profile for investigators to use to solve the mystery. It was determined that the victim was a white female, aged between 35 to 40 years old. Her height was estimated at 5 foot 4 inches, and her weight between 125 to 140 pounds. Her hair was brownish black and short with curls. Examiners added that she had scarring on her abdomen consistent with the cesarean section birth, and internal signs indicated she may have been a mother of 3 children. They determined she may have been married, as a bone indentation was visible on her left ring, showing that she had once used a wedding band, but no jewelry was found on her body. She did not smoke, and lima beans were discovered in her digestive system as the last meal she had eaten. Her clothes were added to the description and included a multicolored size 14 blouse with 5 brass buttons in the pallets and a long-sleeve black cardigan. She wore size 12 burnt orange stretch pants with the label, "Symphony is what's happening," stitched on the inside. On her feet were pixie-style black leather boots that were a size 5.5 and bobby socks that were possibly white at some point. Her hair was described as being salon-styled and her appearance clean and meticulous. Her nails were evenly manicured and clean. What stood out was the extensive dental work she had done. She was missing 2 molars and had a $500 Maryland bridge for dental implants fitted in. It was estimated she had work done on her teeth to the value of almost $21,100. She was given the placeholder name, the Mojave Jane Doe, and kept at the county mortuary until her identity could be determined. A composite drawing was made of the Jane Doe by a Flagstaff police sketch artist, but it remained businesslike and unflattering. This was given to investigators along with the descriptions from the medical examiner. Using this information, investigators worked tirelessly to identify the woman. The first thing the investigators did was place a report in both the local and national papers with a description, composite sketch, and area the victim was found. It did not seem to bring in any promising leads, so they turned their attention to other methods of identification. Given that she seemed to be well-groomed without any signs of neglect, investigators canvassed motels, hotels, and local stores in the area that cater to the upper middle class. Although they questioned people extensively, no one could remember such a woman crossing their paths. Investigators then looked at her clothing and tried to determine from where she had bought her clothes. A visit to all possible clothing outlets produced negative results. Investigators then turned to airports and conducted searches of flight manifestos, questioning staff about any person who had not been accounted for on any flight and followed up with those leads. This too led nowhere. Next, investigators took to placing a missing persons advert in dental magazines, explaining the scope of the work she had done on her teeth. This, they hoped, would jog the memory of the dentist who performed the surgeries and they would come forward with her identity. When this option failed, they went through the filing system of a dentist lab in Phoenix, Arizona. After searching through files of over 8,000 patients, they had still come up short. Investigators widened their nets and set out the missing persons bulletin to Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah. 23 women had been reported missing during that time period, but all were eventually found alive. The Jane Doe, however, was not among any of those reported missing. Investigators made a request for the fingerprints that were taken for record purposes during the autopsy. These were then sent off to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington to be checked against the national database, COIDUS. But still, there was no trace of her on any system, missing or criminal. Investigators eventually turned to looking for a suspect among the hunting community, especially those who applied for hunting licenses during that particular season. Over 5,000 applications had been made, and each and every person was tracked down and questioned. Sheriff Floyd Sisney, Sergeant Don Parrish, and Detective Joe Chapin surmised that their Jane Doe may have been murdered by a spouse. Each applicant who was married was asked to produce their wife for questioning. This too ended up producing no results. The three men strongly believed that the murder was what they called a mama-papa killing by an enraged husband. In speaking with local reporters, Sisney said he believed that eventually her identity would be revealed as she may have children according to the autopsy reports. And somewhere out there, her children are missing their mother and being stalled by their father in search for her. But they'll start worrying before long. Time has a habit of solving murder mysteries, he said. The extensive investigation had covered every possible avenue, but investigators remained hopeful. Said Sisney, "We're still no closer to finding this woman's identity, but somebody out there must have seen her, may even know her, or may remember a small thing that could help us." Although the search for the identity of the Mojave Jane Doe continued in earnest with nationwide interest, no new leads developed. Given all the clues and descriptions, no one ever came forward to claim the victim or report her missing. After 3 months of waiting, authorities eventually buried the Mojave Jane Doe at the Mountain View Cemetery in Kingman, a county cemetery used by the Department for Unclaimed Bodies within Mojave County. Her headstone was simply marked Jane Doe with her date of death as January 29, 1971. Months turned to years, then to decades. 30 years later, in 2001, Lori Miller, an investigator for the Special Investigation Unit SIU, was given the task of identifying the Mojave Jane Doe. The SIU was formed in 1999 as a part of the Mojave County Sheriff's Department initiative to investigate, solve, and eventually close cold cases that had been piling up over the years. By that year alone, there were over 60 unsolved cases, the oldest being the Mojave Jane Doe. It was a painstaking process for Miller and her team as they began the investigation. Like their predecessors, Miller, along with several other investigators, reviewed old case files and reports. They re-interviewed possible witnesses hoping to refresh their memories and maybe pick up some new information and clues. They resubmitted the fingerprints and once again went back to the dental records to find the dentist possible for working on the Jane Doe, but it didn't produce the desired results. Miller and her team also reached out to an artist from the Museum of Northern Arizona to create a composite of the Jane Doe based on the features of her skull taken from the post-mortem examination pictures. They believe the new artist may be able to highlight the victim's features in a more professional way that would possibly catch the attention of someone who knew her. Once again, they used the national media to bring awareness to the case in the hopes that maybe one of the Jane Doe's children or family members may come forward after having not heard from them 3 decades. Again, they had no luck. Miller's investigative team also tried to find links to the company, Deer Pack, Ames, Harris, Neville & Co., which had produced the sack the victim had been found in, but discovered they had long since been bought out. Over the next 20 years, Miller and her team worked through the case periodically. They kept a watchful eye on databases and followed any and every tip and lead. If anything, their Jane Doe was the proverbial needle in the haystack. Investigators led by Miller also attempted to track down the make of the victim's clothes. But too many years had passed and the fashion range had all but disappeared. In November 2021, the case was officially registered to the NAMAS database, but still there were no positive results. Again, investigators found themselves at a dead end with all leads exhausted. However, as a part of their ongoing case review, the Sheriff's Department continued to update their Facebook post regarding missing or unidentified persons. In October 2022, 51 years later after the Mojave Jane Doe was discovered, they were contacted by Othram Inc., a forensic genealogy company based in Texas, on their Facebook page. The company offered to use the new DNA technology being developed by geneticists to try and create a family tree based on their Jane Doe's DNA profile, but it would take time and money as the technology was new and expensive to carry out. Before that, though, investigators tried one more time to post the composite sketch on their Facebook page, hoping to find some tangible leads, but nothing worked out. Miller and her team had realized that there was only one way left. So basically, all we had left was to try to identify her through genetic genealogy, she said. For the investigation team, the case became personal. She was someone's wife, daughter, or mother, and it was possible she was missed. Over the years, the investigation continued to lodge evidence with no results. It became part of their mantra to close the Mojave Jane Doe case and bring closure not only to the family, but for those voiceless victims as well. It was with the fervent prayer that the investigators went ahead with the genetic testing option. The sheriff's office donated $1,000 towards the testing. Miller said that despite being a large county, their population was small and their budget was limited. Othram Inc., however, took it upon themselves to set up a donation page requesting help from the public to raise the remaining $65,100 needed to begin testing. Hoping the community would open their hearts to give the Mojave Jane Doe the dignity of her identity, DNA Solves assisted the crowdfunding initiative by creating a Dear Gladys page. The response was overwhelming. The story of the Mojave Jane Doe touched so many that within 5 days of starting the page, the remaining funds were raised and the testing could begin. The first thing investigators needed to do was exhume the remains of Mojave Jane Doe. After being given the green light by the Mojave County Court in November 2022, excavation of the burial site began. Although the remains were in poor condition due to age, scientists were able to retrieve enough genetic material to perform the testing. The body was reburied as Othram Incorporated prepared to begin the testing process. The technology was new and the process was long. It was trusted, though, as genetic genealogy tested had become popular in 2018 after it helped track down the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years. Using advanced DNA testing, the forensic grade genome sequencing investigators were able to create a DNA profile. This profile was then used to match against ancestry websites that have profiles from thousands of people who have willingly donated their DNA samples in order to trace and track families from around the world. Investigators were able to create several family trees based on the Mojave Jane Doe's DNA profile. Spending countless hours on the family trees, investigators tracked down several distant relatives and, through the process of elimination, tracked down the closest living relatives. They eventually contacted a relative who was willing to provide a fresh DNA sample to assist in the investigation. It took another 3 months before any positive results were confirmed. On Monday, January 23, 2023, 52 years to the date on which the Mojave Jane Doe was discovered, lead investigator Lori Miller received the call she had been waiting for. They had a name. After a half-century, the Jane Doe was discovered to be Colleen Audrey Rice. The news was foreshared with the remaining relatives of Colleen before the announcement was made on the Mojave County Sheriff's Office Facebook page that same Monday afternoon. Colleen was born March 17, 1931 to parents James C. Rice and Flossie Truitt. She was raised in Portsmouth, Ohio, and is known to have a few family ties to eastern Kentucky. It is unclear if she had any siblings. Colleen attended Portsmouth High School, but it was unknown if she graduated as she married William Davis in 1946 at the young age of 15. After searching through old school records, investigators were able to obtain an old yearbook photo to attach her case file. Colleen would have been 39 years old at the time of her death. Little else was known about her personal life. Investigators who tracked down her living relatives did not garner much information as they were mostly distant relations of Colleen. What they did learn was that Colleen had become estranged from her family and husband. Although she showed signs of childbirth, there was no means of finding her children or records to prove if she had any at all. It seemed as if Colleen's life had been erased after she had disappeared. Investigators tried to find possible links to how Colleen arrived in Arizona, but that too dried up quickly. What they did know is that Colleen seemed to have been doing well for herself as she was well-groomed and healthy when her body was first discovered. Investigators had also tried to find out if she had changed her name to start a new life away from her family, but the people in Kingman didn't seem to recognize her as well. Following the investigation, all legal work was completed to allow her living family members the chance to put her remains to rest. Her remains were exhumed and flown to Ohio in February 2023 to be buried alongside her family with a headstone bearing her name and date of birth and death. For investigators, their oldest case was finally gaining traction. They now knew who their victim was. Chief Development Officer at Othram Inc., Kristen Middleman, said it was a relief to finally have the name for the victim. It is heartwarming to witness law enforcement and the public come together to restore a murdered woman's name after a half-century, she said. For the investigators, solving the crime became personal. They believed Colleen deserved better in death. She deserved dignity. Lead investigator investigating the cold case. This was a Jane Doe. Now I have while investigating the cold case. This was a Jane Doe. Now I have a name. She's always been a person. Now she's a person with a name. Kinda hits you, said Miller. According to news reports, Miller said that one of the challenges they faced in the investigation was finding people who were still around from when the incident first happened. It became quite daunting in the fact that we were trying to locate people that were still alive, she said. WOWK 13 News was able to find a distant relative of Colleen's, who's also happened to be a genealogist himself. Eli Allen is related to Colleen from his mother's side of the family and currently lives in Ohio. Allen said that when he first heard about the case and discovered the name of the victim, he realized they were related. When I saw Rice, which is in my mother's line, I had to know we were related because it was that much more intimate, he said. When I saw Rice, which is in my mother's line, have to know how we're related because it was that much more intimate. Identifying Colleen after more than 50 years is a testimony to the work he and so many others are doing. The more baffling question for investigators now is who killed Colleen and discarded her body in such an undignified manner? Autopsy reports did not find any foreign DNA on the victim's body at the time, and the possibility of assault was ruled out entirely. The theory of her being murdered by her husband was also ruled out as interview with the family suggested that Colleen had left of her own volition. No one who knew her personally at the time had seemed particularly interested in finding her as there has never been a missing person report filed. In the 50-year period of the investigation, Colleen's murder had not been linked to any possible murderers who may have been active in the area around the 1970s. Her manner of death did not provide many clues either for investigators to determine patterns related to known serial killers at the time. Even though Colleen had been identified, the case remains ongoing. The SIU is still investigating in the hopes of finding the suspect or suspects responsible for Colleen's untimely death. Investigators are appealing to the public to come forward with any information regarding Colleen's murder and information about her life, since she left her family behind in Ohio to start afresh in Arizona. The public is urged to contact the Mojave County Sheriff's Office Special Investigation Unit. The numbers will be provided in the description box below. In covering cases such as Colleen's, we hope to highlight not only the dedicated work of investigators, but the truly amazing advances in technology that are now making it possible to solve cases that many believe could have remained cold forever. On the morning of July 15, 1980, a group of maintenance workers in Delano, California made their way through the almond orchard for another day of work. As they approached the 13th row of trees, they took notice of what appeared to be a person curled up in a fetal position asleep on the ground. Curiosity compelled them to inspect further, and what they discovered left them reeling and rushing off to contact police immediately. It was the body of a woman who had clearly been murdered. Teams of investigators and crime scene technicians arrived at the almond plantation and began cordoning off the area to begin their investigation. The woman appeared to be of either Native American or Hispanic descent. Investigators immediately noted the lack of blood at the scene and soon found tire tracks that led up to and then away from where the body was found. Another clue was a discarded Michelob beer bottle. They theorized that their victim may have been picked up from a bar known as Ruby's located in Lemoore, an hour away from the farm. Their investigation began immediately as they searched the plantation for clues to her identity. Detectives were dispatched to Ruby's to question staff and patrons of the identity of the woman or any suspicious activity, while other teams combed through the fields. By the afternoon, investigators had not found any of her personal belongings, and the people that were questioned by detectives were unable to provide much information about the woman. The body was transported to the county for a post-mortem examination. Examiners determined she had been murdered a day before being discovered. She had been assaulted before being stabbed. It was overkill with a total of 27 stab wounds, 18 to the chest and 9 defensive wounds on her arms and shoulders. For investigators, it was obvious she fought fiercely against her attacker. Her cause of death was recorded as sharp force trauma as her vital organs had been punctured. Without any form of identification, her fingerprints were taken and sent to the crime lab. However, after running her prints through various databases, there were no records found. The coroner began examining the body for clues that investigators could use in trying to identify her. She had 2 unique tattoos. One was a heart with the words, "I love you, Shirley, and Seattle." The other simply read "Mother" and "I love you." Scars were found on her abdomen, which the examiner believed may have come from an operation or childbirth, and there was scarring on her buttocks. She also wore a prosthetic left leg due to an injury on her upper leg. Her entire set of upper teeth were missing and showed signs of being removed medically. The toxicology report showed that she had been intoxicated with a blood alcohol level of 0.3%. This strengthened the theory that she was possibly picked up from the bar, Ruby's. A detailed profile was developed based on the examiner's findings. She was estimated to be between the ages of 25 to 35 and weighed 115 pounds with a height of 5 feet and 4 inches. She had black hair that was slightly curled and was of Native American descent. Her body showed signs of possibly having given birth at least once. The tattoos suggested that she was a native of Seattle, Washington, and that Shirley was either her real name or that of someone she loved dearly. The clothes she was wearing at the time of her death were a pink top, blue jeans, white shoes, and blue socks. Her body was kept in the county mortuary until she could properly be identified and was given the placeholder name of Kern County Jane Doe. Investigators had also lifted fingerprints from the discarded beer bottle found at the scene and made plaster impressions of the tire tracks found near the victim's body. The forensics team had also taken the clothes of the victim and were able to extract biological material from the items. They also commissioned the medical examiner to provide the nail clippings of the victim in order to test for possible DNA that may have been transferred during the attack. These were all sent for DNA profiling while the investigation continued. But she was just the first victim in what was going to become a decades-long mystery. 3 days after the discovery of the Kern County Jane Doe, law enforcement officials were alerted to another murder in neighboring Ventura County. The body of another female was discovered in the Thousand Oaks High School parking lot on July 18, 1980 in Westlake. When investigators arrived, they noted that the woman was either of Native American or Hispanic descent. She had been partially disrobed and had several visible defensive wounds on her arms. A search of the crime scene indicated that she was murdered elsewhere, as there was no significant amount of blood near the scene. It was also believed that she was brought to the parking lot and dragged from a vehicle, as there was a trail of blood from the edge of the tarmac surface to where the body was found. Investigators were aware that a similar attack had occurred 3 days prior in neighboring Kern County. Although the similarities were striking between both crime scenes, at the time, investigators did not believe they were linked. A search of the nearby area provided no clues for investigators, as there were no tire tracks to be found and no personal belongings of the victim located near the crime scene. The school custodian who had found the body was questioned, but he could not provide any further details except that he had found her while going about his general duties at the school. It was unmistakable to investigators at the time that she was also pregnant. Her body was sent off to the county coroner for further examination. At the coroner's office, the medical examiner determined that the victim had been killed 12 hours before her body was discovered. She had been stabbed 16 times and then strangled to death. The victim had also suffered a brutal assault. The wounds on her arm showed that she had fought her attacker to the very end. The coroner determined that she was between the age range of 20 to 30. Her estimated height was between 5 feet 1 to 5 feet 3 inches and weighed between 100 to 115 pounds. The coroner provided investigators with a detailed profile that included her description and distinguishable marks on her body. The victim was primarily Native American with some Hispanic, Caucasian, Sub-Saharan, and Asian ancestry. She had brown eyes, black hair with bleach blonde tips, and penciled eyebrows as she had shaved her natural brows off. She had a large amount of dental work done and also had pierced ears. She had several scars and birthmarks, including 2 vaccination scars on her left arm and a scar on the left knee. They were able to determine that she was 5 months pregnant with a male child. The baby had appeared to be well-nourished and received proper prenatal care prior to the attack. An episiotomy scar also suggested she may have given birth to at least 1 child before this. Her fingerprints were taken and a search through national databases came up empty. Like the Kern County Jane Doe, she too had no criminal history. The victim had been clothed in a white t-shirt, black bra, white underwear, and red pants. These, along with her fingernail clippings, were all taken and sent off to extract any foreign DNA that could be used to identify her murderer. DNA had also been extracted from the unborn child to conduct a paternity test. While investigators waited on the results, the county coroner gave her the placeholder name Ventura County Jane Doe. Over the next few weeks, authorities in both Kern County and Ventura County worked extensively to uncover the identities of both women. Kern County officials revisited the bar and interviewed more people in and around the area. Investigators also made use of the local media to appeal to anyone who may have known either Jane Doe. It was then that they received a tip from an anonymous female caller who alleged to have known the woman found in the orchard. According to the caller, she went by the name Becky or Rebecca Ochoa, had tattoos similar to that of the victim, and she worked as a waitress at a bar. However, this tip led nowhere. Other people came forward claiming that she had been seen in and around Lemoore for several weeks before her death. According to these witnesses, the victim had worked at a local apple orchard as a farmhand. This lead too failed to produce any useful information in the end. Investigators then took to visiting local tattoo parlors, hoping they would recognize the work and be able to identify the victim. A tattoo artist from Bakersfield said that he did not know the work personally, but provided details to a Los Angeles tattoo parlor that used a similar technique in their designs. He also explained that the area had a large community of Native Americans. Following this lead, detectives set off for Los Angeles. After questioning the artists in the parlor, they realized that their Jane Doe did not have any links to the area, and they were now back at square one. In Ventura County, detectives worked with the theory that their Jane Doe had been kidnapped while hitchhiking near the College of Sequoias in Visalia, California. Investigators also used the media as a way to discover more information about their victim. But unlike the Kern County Jane Doe, no one seemed to recall their victim. Her dental records were distributed to several dental labs, but there was still no match. Without any new leads, these avenues were quickly drying up. Investigators' hopes were dashed again when the paternity tests from the unborn child also proved to be a dead end. The DNA extracted from the unborn child was used to create a profile that could be linked to existing criminal profiles of the CODIS database. However, it seemed that the child's father did not have a criminal history. DNA testing was still in its infancy in the 1980s, and investigators had exhausted every lead possible in trying to identify both women. Both the Jane Does were buried in county cemeteries, but their stories were not forgotten by the investigators who continued to work to restore their identities. The foreign DNA from both women was discovered to be that of an unknown male. Investigators, though, continued to keep both investigations separate, believing the murders were pure coincidence. This was filed away, and over the next 30 years, DNA results would periodically be submitted by investigators who were given the reins of the cold cases in both counties. A fresh set of eyes meant a new approach to the case. Investigators were sure that the murderer would have committed more crimes since 1980. With technological advancements, it was possible their suspect was now on their systems. In 2008, Kern County officials were able to find a match to the DNA recovered from their Jane Doe. It had been linked to a 51-year-old man named Wilson Chuist, who was already in custody in California. Wilson Claude Chuist Jr. was born on December 2, 1951 in New Orleans, Louisiana. According to reports, Wilson's childhood was tough as his parents were always at odds with each other. When he was younger, Wilson had a desire to become a priest. But after being expelled from a Catholic school for beating another student, those ambitions were dashed. He soon gave in to the darker side of life and began abusing drugs. At the age of 18, he enrolled in the army but was discharged after being deemed unsuitable for service. After returning home, Wilson decided to get married and settle down in Los Angeles in 1969. The couple seemed happy enough and even had a daughter. But cracks in the marriage appeared as Wilson turned to a life of crime. His first major crime occurred in October 1977. He had given a lift to a young woman who had been standing on the side of a road in Los Angeles. Once she got in, he then abducted her and drove her to a remote location. Wilson then assaulted her and attempted to strangle her to death. He assumed she died after she had fallen unconscious. After he left her body in a ditch, she regained her senses and was charged with abduction in November 1977. He was paroled in June 1980. It wouldn't last long, though. In August 1980, just 2 months after his release, he committed a robbery. That same month, he attempted to abduct another woman outside the College of Sequoias in Visalia. He had threatened her with violence if she refused to cooperate, but his plan was foiled by 2 witnesses who were walking by at the same time. In September 1980, he went on to abduct and assault another woman who he released after she told him she was married. He was ultimately caught and convicted for all 3 crimes. He was sentenced to 12 years to life in prison that same year. Wilson, though, was paroled in 2004 after serving 24 years, but the committee reversed their decision after concluding that he showed no remorse. He was, however, eligible for another parole hearing in 2016. While still behind bars, investigators were able to link Wilson's DNA to that of the DNA profile recovered from the Kern County Jane Doe. However, he was not immediately charged, and there was never a reason given for this. In 2012, having heard how officials in Kern County linked Wilson to an unsolved murder from July 1980, Ventura County officials submitted the DNA profile of their cold case suspect to CODIS to test against any possible matches to convicts already on the system. In January 2013, they had a match. Their Jane Doe had also been linked to Wilson Chuist through DNA found on her clothes and fingernails. It baffled investigators in both counties as they had spent all these years investigating both cases whose similarities were striking, but never linked. The fight for justice, though, was far from over. Although DNA had linked Wilson to both murders, it had still not been able to identify both the Jane Does. When the case was brought to the district attorney's office in Ventura County, one of the attorneys opted not to pursue the cold case with unknown victims. Senior Deputy District Attorney John Barak, though, was not willing to give up. He wanted to prosecute Wilson for the murders of both Kern County and Ventura County Jane Does. Under the laws of murder, I don't have to prove their identity. I just have to prove that they're a human being. I thought it was worth the effort, because if we don't, then these women will never get the justice they deserve, even if we don't know their names. And there's a good possibility that Wilson is going to get out, and that is not a person who deserves to be out among law-abiding citizens, said Barack. While still in custody, Wilson Chuist was transferred to Ventura County on September 23, 2015 by a court order. While being held at the county jail, he was charged and arrested with 3 counts of murder. The deaths of both Jane Does, the death of the unborn child of Ventura County Jane Doe. From the outset, Wilson denied all responsibility for the assault and murders of both women. For the next 3 years, Barack, along with several prosecutors from both Kern County and Ventura County, worked to provide a compelling argument that would see Wilson pay for his crimes. His trial began on May 14, 2018. 3 of the women who survived his attacks testified in court and described Wilson as being predatory in nature. Their testimonies were similar in the way they had been approached by Wilson and lured into his car. Another witness who came forward was Patrick Scott Bell. Patrick had been a teenager in 1980 and had often stayed with Chuist, who was a family friend. He told the court of how Wilson had confessed to him that he had killed and dumped the body of an unknown woman. He also explained that he and his brothers had helped Wilson clean his car one evening. And when confronted by their mother, Carolyn Bell lied that Wilson had hit a deer. This confession was corroborated by Carolyn Bell both in a previous interview from 2013 and in court. After the confessions, prosecutors then used physical evidence that was found at the Kern County crime scene. DNA and fingerprints taken from the discarded beer bottle had been previously matched to Wilson. The DNA extracted from the Jane Doe's clothes and fingernails also proved a positive match. Wilson's defense attorney, Andrei Nintchev, presented a weak argument by stating his client and the women had consented to intimacy. He also argued that there was no physical evidence from the Ventura County crime scene to prove Wilson was actually there. After a 2-week-long trial, Wilson was found guilty of the murders of both adult victims on May 31, 2018. The jury voted unanimously in favor of a guilty verdict. However, they could not convict him for the murder of the unborn child, as the laws referenced by the prosecution in order to find him guilty of the murder were only changed after 1994. The death penalty was not pursued due to Wilson's age and the lack of witnesses testifying on his behalf. On July 12, 2018, Wilson was sentenced to serve 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving out his sentence at the California Substance Abuse Treatment Facility and State Prison in Corcoran. Although Wilson was convicted and charged in the murders of both Jane Does, it did not bring investigators any closer to giving them their names back. But DNA testing had now advanced substantially since 1980s. And Ventura County cold case investigator Steve Rhodes knew that a new genetic genealogy testing method was being used to identify suspects from decades-old cold cases. It had put the Golden State Killer behind bars. Could surely help identify the victims. In partnership with the DNA Doe Project, DDP, an all-volunteer group that makes use of genetic genealogy to identify John and Jane Does, both the Kern County and Ventura County officials submitted their DNA samples for genetic testing. The DDP has been credited with positively identifying a victim of serial killer John Wayne Gacy. So far, the DDP has been able to find locations and surnames of distant relatives that may be related to the Ventura County Jane Doe. These have been listed on their website and Facebook page and include Southern Texas, Central Mexico, Northern New Mexico, Indigenous California, and Guatemala. She has still not been identified by relatives. In 2021, investigators were able to find the father of her unborn child. It is believed he is an immigrant from Honduras who had ties to the Central American community within the Koreatown district of Los Angeles. Investigators were unable to make contact with him and get any information regarding their Jane Doe. They are, however, actively pursuing any leads and are urging relatives to come forward to volunteer their DNA. The Kern County Jane Doe proved a bit more difficult as the DNA retrieved had degraded over time, and it took a while to find anything that could be used. Her investigation began in May 2019. The DDP found that the victim was indigenous with parents likely from Maquaches, Alberta, Canada. The problem was that a very few indigenous people had provided their DNA profiles to genealogy websites. An appeal was made on the DDP Facebook page requesting people of indigenous ancestry to upload their DNA in order to help solve the case. This appeal was seen by Violet Susie, who had been searching for her missing aunt, Shirley and Susie, for decades. Violet submitted her DNA to GeneMatch in February 2020. After testing confirmed that Violet was in fact a close relative of the Kern County Jane Doe. The DNA Doe Project made the announcement in April 2021 that Shirley was born on February 6, 1945 on the Sampson Cree Nation Reserve in Alberta, Canada. She had 7 siblings who were all part of a close-knit family unit. Shirley was just 14 years old when her father passed away. This caused financial difficulties as the family could not handle the responsibilities of maintaining their ranch. She chose to eventually leave the reservation in search of a job to support her family. Shirley initially intended to move the nearby city of Edmonton, but ended up moving to Vancouver, British Columbia. Here, she would eventually get married to a man named Adam Misko in 1963 and gave birth to 2 boys and a girl. But life did not get any easier. After a turbulent few years, her marriage ended and all 3 of her children were taken away and placed in foster care before being adopted. She was unable to regain custody of her children and became homeless. Shirley turned to alcohol and substance abuse to cope with her depression. She sometimes returned to Alberta, but her family had noticed the change in her personality. The last time she was seen by her relatives was in 1977 when she returned for her brother's funeral. She expressed her desire to not return to Alberta, but did mention that she would be visiting a friend in Seattle, Washington. Allegedly, it was Shirley's mother who asked her daughter to get tattoos that would distinguish her from other people and make it easy to identify her if something happened. Shirley maintained contact with her family through letters, but that ceased after June 1980. Family members searched the Vancouver area for decades, but eventually resorted to visiting cemeteries believing she had died. Following the discovery, Violet Susie said that she had made her grandmother a promise to find Shirley and return her to the family. Her remains were flown to Edmonton Airport on May 26, 2022. Before her casket was returned to her family, members of the Tule River Tribe of California held a ceremony with blessings and songs. Officials from the Kern County Sheriff's Office joined them in saying their final goodbye. For Violet, it was a relief to finally fulfill the promise she made. Shirley and Susie was laid to rest at her family's resting place in Riverside Cemetery on May 27, 2022. Violet now encourages Indigenous people to train in DNA research so they too can conduct their own forensic investigations. She continues to work with investigators to help other Indigenous families find their missing loved ones through a genetic genealogy database. "That is the hope I want to give to people in similar situations as mine," she said. As impossible as the task seemed in 1980, investigators' fervent pursuit of justice, combined with the advancements made in DNA technology and testing, has finally brought a killer to justice and peace to family who had been searching for far too long for their loved one. So far, more than half the battle has been won. But as technology progresses, hope remains in identifying the Ventura County Jane Doe. What are your thoughts on the progress made by technology and helping identify and bring closure to families who have spent years searching for answers about the whereabouts of their missing loved ones? What had started as the best night of Blake Chappell's life ended in mystery. The 17-year-old from Sonoa, Georgia had attended his high school homecoming dance surrounded by friends on October 15, 2011. Blake's mother, Melissa, dropped him off at his girlfriend's house, and it had been planned that Blake would spend the night at his friend, Austin's house, so she didn't plan on seeing him until the following day. Blake called his mom after the dance to let him know that he'd had a great time. He'd said goodbye and hung up. From the school, Blake was picked up by his girlfriend's mother. He had been allowed to stay after the dance to watch a movie, and then Blake was dropped off back at Austin's house. He was supposed to stay the night there, but at some point in the night, he left and walked back to his girlfriend's house. He snuck in through her bedroom window where he spent an hour or so. In the early morning hours around 5:30 a.m., He was caught by his girlfriend's parents and chased out of the house. He was witnessed walking in the direction of Austin's house. Cell phone records show he had sent several text messages apologizing to his girlfriend's mom for breaking their rules and also messaging his girlfriend. His last text message to his girlfriend said that a cop was pulling him over. He had mentioned he was near Austin's house and was about at a bridge. At around 11 a.m., Melissa received a call from Austin asking if Blake had gone home. Austin told her that Blake had left his house late that night to see his girlfriend, but never came back like he said he was going to. Melissa checked the home to make sure Blake hadn't come home in the night and confirmed he wasn't there. From there, she called Blake's girlfriend's parents, who confirmed he'd been there unbeknownst to them, but had left in the morning. Melissa called the Newnham Police Department by noon to report a missing, and the search began right away. Blake had been going through some odd legal troubles. That previous summer, he had been dating someone else. The girl had been 16 and ran away from home, allegedly escaping her abusive stepfather. When she was found, she was with Blake as he'd been trying to help her. Her parents filed charges alleging he had kidnapped her. Because Blake was 17, he was an adult in accordance with the law, and she was a minor. He had spent 16 days in jail until he was released on bond. Blake was set to have his first court appearance in that matter on October 24th, though the charges had already been likely to be dismissed by the prosecution. Statements from the girlfriend backed up Blake's claims that he was only trying to help when she had run away and he had not kidnapped her. During the incident, the stepfather had punched him in the face and threatened to kill him several times, even showing him he was carrying a gun. Blake had been terrified over the incident. He was only 17 and being threatened by a volatile man. Blake and his mother had moved shortly after the incident, though it still was concerning. His mom had instructed him to cut contact with any friends from that area due to ongoing threats Blake had been receiving, and they didn't want Blake to be found by this man. When Blake had first disappeared, it was initially thought that he may have run away because of the court appearance. He had no idea that the case was close to being dropped. He was searched for weeks with no sign of him anywhere. His phone had been dark since the early morning hours the morning he went missing. 2 months after his disappearance on December 19th, a discovery was made. The body of a young man was found in a creek at the Summer Grove subdivision, halfway between his girlfriend's house and Austin's house. The body was quickly identified as Blake, and his cause of death had been a close-range gunshot wound to the back of the head. He was found wearing only his underwear and an undershirt. No other clothing or belongings were found in the area. His backpack, cell phone, pants, and hoodie are still missing. The medical examiner estimated his time of death to be close to October 16th and had likely been murdered close to when his phone last connected to a cell tower around 6 a.m. An extensive investigation was launched, but there was little evidence to forensically point to a suspect. Officials have gone on record to clear several suspects, but they have one suspect yet to be cleared. There's a $20,000 reward being offered for any information leading to an arrest. Was a warm evening on May 24, 2002 in Terre Haute, Indiana. 20-year-old Scott Javins was at a house party when he received a call from his mom at 1:57 a.m. It had been a brief conversation, and he told her that he was on his way home. Scott, a University of Indiana student, had to work the next morning. He said his goodbyes, and friends had offered him several rides home as he'd been drinking at the party. He declined all offers for a ride and got into his brand new Honda Civic at 2:30 a.m. His mom called him again at 2:37 a.m., but it went to voicemail. Concern grew as time went on. He didn't live far from where the party was, less than 15 minutes. Scott didn't show up for the rest of the night, nor did he show up for work the next morning, which was highly unusual. He was reported missing by his family that day. Despite an extensive search, there was no sign of Scott or his vehicle anywhere. Several witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Scott murdered for the theft of his vehicle. One witness said that she saw 4 people drag Scott out of his car, beat him, and abduct him. It was determined that this witness was lying in an attempt to incriminate people she knew. She was charged and sentenced to prison time for wasting police resources and fabricating a police report. Terre Haute rallied behind the Javins family. Local businesses and restaurants helped to raise funds and donations. At one point, there was a $100,000 raised as a reward for information in Scott's disappearance. However, the reward money may have done more harm than good. After the announcement, several tips came in across the nation. One tip led investigators on a dive expedition in Terre Haute's Cassis Lake. While the car was discovered, it did not belong to Scott. In 2007, a tip led investigators to another body of water, the Fairbanks Park along the Wabash River. At the time of the search, the section of the river could get up to 20 feet deep, but at this time, the river had significantly receded. They looked around a concrete boat launch and made a discovery. 7 feet deep was a Honda Civic hatchback matching Scott's vehicle. Once removed from the river, they were able to match the car's VIN number and confirm it belonged to Scott. Skeletal remains were found in the vehicle, and dental records confirmed that they had found Scott Jevons. Scott's watch had stopped at 2:33 a.m., giving investigators an approximate time when the watch was submerged. The car's driver's side window was open, his cell phone was plugged into his car charger, his wallet and cash were recovered in the car, and there was no sign of any violence in the car or on the remains. The car was found in fifth gear, and investigators theorized that maybe Scott had pulled over. Maybe because he wasn't feeling well, possibly realizing he'd drunk too much and shouldn't be driving. It was also very late in the morning. Perhaps he opened the window to stay awake. Police theorized that it had likely been an accident. The car was new, and maybe he'd meant to put the car in park and accidentally put it in fifth, and the car rolled into the water and he drowned. Where he had been was a dark, unlit area. The evening brought a misty fog, and even if he had regained consciousness when the car hit the water, the darkness combined with the mist may have made it impossible to orient himself out of vehicle. The Terre Haute Police Department closed the case, but Scott's family still hoped for more answers. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.